Hi, my name is Alexandra Christina Sakac, and I'll be presenting the theory of value. So there are two categories. The intrinsic theory of value is based on the value you give to a commodity based on different factors that are objective and measurable. The subject theory of value is quite the opposite because the value given to the product is based on the value that the producer gives to the product for the achievement of his desired ends, so it is not based on objective and measurable component. So starting with the objective theory of value, there is the exchange theory of value, monetary theory of value, power theory of value, but the most important one was the labor theory of value that was explained by the classical theories of value and have been brought up by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. The labor theory of value was an early attempt by economists to explain why goods were exchanged for certain relative prices on the market. It suggested that the value of a commodity was determined by and could be measured objectively by the average number of labor hours necessary to its production. So basically, the amount of labor that goes into producing an economic good is the source of that good's value. Sometimes the labor theory of value is generalized a bit more by including in the equation other inputs, and the theory turns into a cost of production theory of value. But in all forms, in the labor theory of value and its broader interpretations, we consider the value of outputs as being determined by the value of the inputs that went into producing these goods. Adam Smith borrowed the water-diamond paradox from Law without admitting it, but he was not able to resolve the relationship between use value and exchange value because by mistake he focused on the total utility instead of focusing on the marginal utility. The use value is the satisfaction that someone gets from the use of a commodity. For example, water has big use value because it quenches thirst, and without it, daily life would just not be possible. Exchange value is the amount of goods and services which we can get in a market in exchange of a particular good. Example, 1 kilo of potatoes equals 1 dozen of eggs, but this is not the marginal utility. Smith provided a labor cost and labor command theory of value for a primitive society, and finally a cost of production theory for an advanced one. His notion of labor cost of value is determined by the quantity of labor, which is measured by wages, which also extended to his labor command theory. In a primitive society, the amount of labor that you put into producing a good determines its exchange value. But in a more advanced society, the market price is no longer proportional to labor cost, since the value of the good now includes compensation for the owner of the means of production of the good. For Marx, however, it was not enough for two goods to have an equivalent amount of labor. For him, the two goods must have the same amount of socially necessary labor. So what it means is that it's an average of the labor hours necessary to the production of the said good within the entire society. Karl Marx sometimes described capital as accumulated labor because it is the result of labor done in the past, and it has become embodied in the form of tools, machines, and factories, in the form of materials, and also in the form of savings. So the capital equals the means of production. Ricardo's labor theory of value says that the value of a good, which is how much of another good it exchanges for in the market, is proportional to how much labor was necessary in order to produce it, and this includes the labor required to produce the raw materials and machinery used in the process. Following Smith, he argued that although a good must have utility, if it is to have value, the value is determined by its production cost and not by its utility. He wants the value of a good to be represented by the relative quantity of labor which is necessary to its production and not by the wages the laborers are paid. It is possible to spend an important quantity of labor time on producing a good that ends up having little or no value. Goods that require the same amount of labor time to produce often have very different market prices on a regular basis, and the observed relative prices of goods fluctuate over time regardless of the quantity of labor time needed to their production and often do not maintain a natural price. The subjective theory of value was meant to solve the problem of the objective theory of value. This theory says that the exchange value given to a good is based on individual subject evaluations of its use good. So value emerges from human perceptions of usefulness, which means that people produce economic goods because they value them. This theory also reversed the relationship between input costs and market prices. While the labor theory was saying that input costs determined final prices, the subjective theory showed that the value of inputs was based on the potential market price of final goods. In the subjective theory of value, the use value people get from goods makes them willing to expend labor to produce them. For the rising neoclassical school, the classical cost of production theory of value seriously lacked generality. Jevons and Menger each formulated their marginal utility theory in which value depends entirely on utility. They felt like no matter what costs were incurred in producing a good, when it arrived on a market, its value would depend entirely on the utility the buyer expects to receive. Menger used his marginal utility table to explain the old water-diamond paradox. The value of diamonds was greater than the value of water because it was marginal utility and not total utility that determines consumer's choice, and hence value contrary to what was saying Smith. For this, he also argued that the value comes from the future and not the past projections. Alfred Marshall was combining the best of classical analysis with the new tools of the marginalists in order to explain value in terms of supply and demand. He said that the study of any economic concept like value is obstructed by the interrelativeness of the economy and varying time effects. According to Alfred Marshall, a correct understanding of the influence of time and interdependence of economic variables would resolve the controversy over whether it was the cost of production or the utility which determines the value of a good or of a service. In conclusion, classicals came up with the labor theory of value in order to determine the value of a good or a service. Then the neoclassicals came up with the subjective theory of value that was supposed to help solve the problem of the labor theory of value. In the end, both theories are still being used to a certain extent, but each have their flaws.